term, I think. So, on
Yes,
page,
yeah.
on page 11,
Okay.
do you want to read that? Or, well, whoever, page 11 is the definition sheet. Because it is true, there are a lot of different papers, so it can,
Give me
it's funny, I'm sitting in a little bit of a seminar on Newman, and so it kind of reminded me, like, actually, there's all these different papers, it can take a little bit to find it.
So
I've been doing this for so many years, I immediately know where everything is. But, and of course I get it out beforehand. So page 11.
page 11, the midterm, part 1, 55 minutes. Section 1 is definitions, around 15 of them. They're worth 40 points. Section 2, identify quotations by the author. Pre-Socratics, see the list in the vertical handout. And Plato, if Plato, state which work, i.e. Republic or Symposium. That is worth 10 points.
Does anyone have the vertical handout? If you have it, I could just show you really quick. And then if I show them. So, and it says it there, overview of pre-Socratics, review for midterm. So we're not going to look at that in class, really. I mean, it's just summarizing the main figures for you. So there it is. This is the last thing from Plato, and then there, that list. So you can see, the main thing about this, it just shows you, it's only the major figures, right? So Parmenides is a major figure, Melissus is a kind of a minor figure, Zeno is kind of minor, right? Because Parmenides is the founder of the Eleatic school, right? So notice like some of the minor figures that we just like, we didn't even do Philolaus. He's a Pythagorean who's in the book, there's about 10 pages on him. We didn't even do him this year, right? So Philolaus is not on there. Notice for the sophists, there's about a half dozen sophists: Gorgias, Pythagoras, Antiphon, right? Thrasymachus, right? There's not like one major sophist really, so I won't give any text from the sophist. You see, so I'm basically giving you the main figures. You understand that we kind of spend more time on. So if it's not, this is for. Like list of philosophers' approach and first principles used for exam identifications, or used for exam identifications, right? So, and then they're in chronological order.
Brief question. On the identify the quotations by the author, will these be quotations that we've seen in class, or maybe not?
I try to make them stuff that we've seen in class. I try to, but it's, like I said, it depends on what, you know.
Discussed in class.
Yeah, what we discuss kind of varies depending on what questions arise and so forth. And I just recommend for that, I don't know, like different people learn different ways. I mean, like color coding, maybe you should color code it. But definitely, you know, you can read them more than once. That's the thing with the pre-Socratics, right? Like, I mean, one guy, there's only one quote, what is it, Anaximander? There's only one direct quote from Anaximander. So that one's pretty easy. But now with Empedocles on the other hand, we were just saying there's what is there, like 10, 15 pages or something of quotes. Heraclitus had more. So I don't even have Pythagoras on there, even though Pythagoras is very important because there's no direct quotes from him. There is that one direct quote about the person beating the puppy, but I still haven't found it in here. And the reincarnating person in the puppy. Does that answer your question?
That does answer the question.
Will the quotes be like very emblematic of that?
Right. So I'm not like such a, you know, some of these are so vague. So I try to make it emblematic.
Okay, great.
But still, you
That's
want to
so
be
Heraclitus.
familiar with what is that?
It's going to be like, that's so Heraclitus.
Right. I mean, I would say about half of them are just obvious, and maybe 3 or 4 of them are a bit more. You need to have. You want to spend some time with the text. Like basically, I recommend reading more than once. Remember the fragments are in italics. They're not from any testimonies, so it's only italicized text, namely fragments from the authors on that vertical that list there. Okay. So, but reading it with philosophy, you just keep circling back to the same text. I mean, we're all familiar with that as it is a big advantage to be Catholic in the sense that, right? We're familiar with the idea that, like at Mass, how many times you hear the same things, probably hundreds and hundreds, eventually thousands of times. You keep circling back. But you do, you know, then you'll be at Mass, you've heard that gospel 500 times before, but then for some reason it clicks and you understand a new way. That's kind of what the pre-Socratics were like, especially someone like Heraclitus. You see new implications, so yeah, that's, I would recommend, and maybe whatever, if I want to memorize something, I usually try to color code it, like maybe use one color for Heraclitus or one color for the Milesians, that might help.
Just real quick, for Pythagoras, who's on the list, is it kind of like his?
He is on there?
Yeah, he is on the list. Is it like his Symbology?
So in that case, okay, thank you for telling me that, yeah. Because there are no fragments from him. I know, I just put him on there because he's important. Maybe, why don't you put him in brackets?
Okay.
I wanted to have him on there because he is important for purposes of understanding Plato. I don't want to leave him off. But just put him in like square brackets or curvy brackets, so you know that he's not. You can't use him for fragments because there are no fragments from him. Like even though, does he put it in? Does he put it in?
In italics, yeah.
Yeah, he does. Yeah. There's no one who really agrees that because he had a secret teaching.
Mm-hmm.
There's not agreement among scholars that those are direct quotes from him, because the teachings were secret and those were divulged later. So, I mean, it would be pretty easy, like, what is it, abstain from beans and stuff like that. That would be kind of a giveaway. But it was Pythagoras. Yeah.
Okay. Part 2, 55 minutes. Section 3, choice of one essay, 50 points. On pre-Socratics and Plato. For the essay, no credit is given for reiterating definitions from section 1.
Okay. Want to read next thing?
Note for those interested in qualifying for the MA program. For section 2, one must be familiar with which primary texts or major points belong to which authors. One can attain this by reading their texts closely and reflectively. For the exam essay, try to provide original analysis and or insights into the primary text beyond what was given in lectures and vocabulary, based on a repeated rereading of those texts.
Kind of like I was saying before. Okay, so I'm checking here. Yes, I'm sorry, guys.
Is he on there?
Pythagoras is on there, and because, can I show them? Or you had it open there, right?
Yes.
Because there are fragments, because there are stuff that he has in italics, I just decided to treat that as
Okay.
as fragments. Where is it there? Right, the Symbola is there, and these couple of pages, yeah. But not any of the testimonies. So in general, it's only stuff that's right in italics, not the testimonies. He's back on the main. Sorry
It's
about
like
that.
Pythagoras
I should
is
have
back on the
checked
menu board.
before I spoke, but I didn't want to keep you guys waiting. Okay, so for section 2, one must be familiar with which primary text. Yeah, the reason I added him, he used to not be on there, and then I added him on there about 2 or 3 years ago, because we used to spend like 10 minutes on Pythagoras. And then this time we spent a whole class. We actually, spent some time with it. So that's why I added it. That's why I added it. For section 2, must be familiar with primary text. Right. This identification section, or major points belong to which authors. So, right, even somewhat stylistically, like, those weird sayings with the secret meaning, right, that the Pythagorean school put forward. One can attain this by reading the text closely. Okay. For the exam essay, try to provide original analysis. Yeah, based on so sometimes if you reread the text, something new will come to mind, and if that's possible, like. But the essay, as far as the essay, it's on the pre-Socratics and Plato. Now it basically includes everything that we've done so far, but so like the mythos versus logos idea, like that might come up, but that wouldn't be like, it's mainly focusing on the pre-Socratics and Plato and the main figures. So like Zeno isn't really he's important, but he's a secondary figure, right, who's trying to support Parmenides, right? He's not like, I'm not going to ask you to write an essay on Zeno. So that list, once again, of the main figures, that gives you an idea of who would actually be on there, the secondary or tertiary, as we say. Any other questions? Okay.
So I guess kind of thinking about how the essay could look. Is it going to be, we're going to have some topics, we can choose one, and then we just kind of go and write a
So
page or?
When you think about the essay, so first of all, it is structured around the definitions
Sure.
to some degree, or to considerable degree, really. And it's, so you use the definitions to write the essay. So certain of the definitions, so even by looking, I mean,
Bless you.
if it's not on the first day of the definitions, that gives you a bit of a hint.
Okay.
But if you look at the topics there on the syllabus, and you don't have to take it out necessarily, but like that's one way to think of possible essay topics, would be look at the topics on the syllabus. I'm just saying this for all my courses, and I think maybe for courses in general. But really, it'll be a compare and contrast. Because, right, that's a lot of what philosophy is, and later when you do theology, you'll be doing the same thing, like a compare and contrast Augustine and Bonaventure on X, Y, and Z, right? So that would be the one thing for me to think about is what kind of things you compare and contrast with different individuals, because there are obviously differences with different approaches that we've seen. Okay. All right, so let's go back to Empedocles. So I guess we could read on the definition sheet really quick here, since I just have a short Empedocles 6 principles. Eric, do you want to read that?
On what page?
On page 8. I think it's, you said Empedocles is how we usually say it.
Six principles. 4 kinds of matter, 2 contrary processes, compare forces. 1 through 4, water, earth, air, fire. 5, love, principle of unity, stability. 6, strife, principle of division, separation, change.
Okay. So let's go to, as I said before, I think my take on him is that he's a materialist. It's very clear that the soul is material. Now on page 141, you can see that Wheelwright, he titles that section of fragments reincarnation, right? Well, remember, this is where it's always important that if, like even in scripture, right, the chapter division, I'm sure you guys heard this, right, that wasn't put there by the author. Or any like subtitles in the scriptural text were not put there by the author. This subtitle is not from Empedocles. However, it is clear that he's talking about reincarnation. And so I think there's 2 possibilities. I think the least likely, what's less likely is that he actually is holding to that. The problem is that's not really consistent with what he uses elsewhere. What's more likely is that, so one of the testimonies said that he was a student of Pythagoras. Diogenes Laertius says that. Is that he's summarizing Pythagoras in this poem, that he's presenting Pythagoras. And maybe even making fun of him. So like number 100 kind of sounds a bit humorous. Do I read it?
Yes. Wretches, utter wretches, keep your hands away from demons.
Right, do you see how he could be making fun of him?
Can this one be on the test?
Well, the problem is it Pythagoras or is it, yeah, is it might be confusing, that would be a difficult one, because you might think, oh, it must be Pythagoras. But actually it's Empedocles. So, number 101.
Alas, that some day of doom did not destroy me before my lips committed the sin of wrong devouring.
Right, so it's possible he's being sarcastic. Because remember, I mean, philosophers will often speak about what previous philosophers said. So what Diogenes Laertius says, I'll just summarize so we don't have to read it, but it's that long testimony from him. He says that Empedocles was a student of Pythagoras, and that he was kicked out of the school, right, which is a dramatic thing, because remember they had the whole community life and everything, because he divulged the secret teachings. in his poem. So this is where, like, work on the Species of Socrates is basically like detective work, right? Trying to figure out what's going on, because we just have fragments, right, which makes it very difficult. And I mean, it's even difficult if you have a whole text, frankly, in philosophy. But when you have fragments, it makes it more difficult. So because and he doesn't just say that he divulged it, because if he just says he divulged it, well, that wouldn't really be very illuminating, because it would just be, well, you know, if he divulged it verbally, it wouldn't necessarily bear upon the text. But he says that he divulged it in his poem. Also, the fact that you would release the great secrets of the Pythagoreans, right, which they had been jealously guarded for, you know, after, right, for, I don't know, a long period of time. It shows that maybe he didn't take them very seriously, right? Maybe he disagreed with them. Because normally if you agree with, there's a secret teaching you agree with, you're not going to tell it to the whole world. And it does seem like there's an element of sarcasm here, right? Especially with the beans, that sounds like. And then, right, the sin of wrong devouring, that, oh, alas, this tragedy. And if there's one thing that's easy to make fun of in Pythagoras, it'd be the idea that you can't eat beans, right? That's there's a thing about, I think when Pythagoras, when they came and attacked his I don't want to call it a compound, that sounds bad, his, community, he was fleeing and there were beans, and he refused to cross the field because it had beans in it. He went around it even though, because he was so committed to, you know, the beans' purpose.
In kind of light of that, I do wonder, in the kind of, especially in the reincarnation for fragment 94, it seems that Empedocles also, it seems, at least in this fragment, it seems he's also using love and strife as sort of like a way of life as well. He talks about like people who follow the way of strife.
Right. In which one? You said
94, fragment 94.
Right.
So
yeah, so that shows you, he's definitely using, that's his idea.
Mm-hmm.
But it's, right, so it's possible, I mean, it's possible that maybe he's agreeing with Pythagoras. But the reason I'm skeptical is because we've seen with Heraclitus, right? Like it sounds like, you know, war makes some into men, others into gods. And yet then he says, well, right, then we saw other things where it's clear that he actually doesn't think there's gods. Right? So that's why, and there are a lot of, not just verbal echoes, but even like clear indebtedness to Heraclitus. So it would just be in that Heraclitean tradition of speaking about, hiding what you're saying, basically. There's a 20th century philosopher named Strauss, and he's famous for applying that to everything, saying there's a secret teaching in pretty much every philosopher, which is overstating the case, right? There's no secret teaching in Aristotle. But it is true that with Heraclitus, we saw that. But the other thing would just be that he's summarizing Pythagoras, and then finally, after he summarizes him, he kind of pokes fun at him a little bit because he doesn't agree with that, right? He's the 100 and 101. And even number 94, right? The force of the air swirls him into the sea spits him out onto dry earth. The earth tosses him into the beams of the fiery sun. This is like supposed to be reincarnation? Like that it could seem like he's making fun of it, because normally reincarnation, you know, the merits of life, of the present life, is what determines the fate in the future life. But here you're just being cast about by the elements. So is he really talking about the reincarnation of your soul, or is she just talking about the elements that make up your body are just passing through nature? So is it that reincarnation, is just that, right, the carbon that makes up your body, right, when you die, it goes into the earth, and then the grass springs up from the earth, and then a sheep comes along and eats the grass, and so now you're reincarnated into the sheep. And then it keeps going. The sheep dies and the carbon goes in. I'm saying carbon to make it very clear, but they would say earth back then. Decomposes, and then, I don't know, a deer eats that grass. And so now the earth that made you up has now taken on the form of a sheep, and now it's taken on the form of a deer, and now it's taken on the form of grass, and so on and so forth. So that would be the materialist way to read it, and mortalist. So immortalism is just the idea that the soul is immortal. mortalism is the idea that the soul is not immortal. And that would be a way to read it in a mortalist way, not as an immortal soul. But it's true that he does say in 94, right, you become Wheelwright introduces the word becomes, so you gotta be careful, right? But such a man, he does say a daimon, right, endowed with a long stretch of life. But is that symbolic the same way that Heraclitus is saying that war makes some into gods, some into men, is symbolic? And so part of why I'm pretty confident that he's just a materialist is because no one ever says, none of the testimonies, like Aristotle, remember Aristotle's pretty close, Plato is pretty close. Aristotle never says Empedocles teaches the reincarnation. They do say that, like, Plato and Aristotle will both mention, or Socrates, depending if it's right, will say that Pythagoras taught reincarnation. Herodotus says Pythagoras was the one who introduced reincarnation among the Greeks. So see, that's Herodotus, since he's not even a philosopher, it shows like that's something that he considers common knowledge. It's not something that he considers controversial, right? Because he's a historian just saying that, right? And so, see what I mean? It's the fact that no one ever mentions the fact that he followed Pythagoras on reincarnation. That's what makes me think that they realized, because remember, they had the whole poem back then, right? That when you read the whole poem, you could see, he has a section where he's like, and now I'm going to tell you what Pythagoras taught. And Pythagoras said that there's an oracle of necessity, an ancient degree of the gods, eternal enticing. Read number 94, see? And then towards the end, at the end of presenting Pythagoras, he decides to make fun of him. And he's also just divulged the secret teaching. You can imagine how angry that would make people, right? Because the whole point is supposed to be a secret, right? Think about that. If anyone's ever broken a secret that you told them. So, but then he's like, wretches, keep your hands away from beans. He's basically making fun of. He's like, well, this is why I broke off from the Pythagoreans. So, but anyway, as I was saying to Matthew, in the class, they just about, I think it was like 2015, they came out with the latest edition of the Pre-Socratics, which is good because the standard edition is called Fragmenta der Vorsokratiker, which is in German. And so it gives you the Greek text and a German translation, which isn't a much use unless your German's good enough to breeze through that, right? Or your Greek is good enough to just read it. And now they finally came out, the Loeb edition, finally, it's hard to believe, but there was never a full translation of that German book that came out, like 1920 or something? So almost 100 years later, they finally came out with, the Loeb Classical Library publishes pretty much everything in Latin and Greek in a bilingual edition, meaning it has the Greek or Latin on the left-hand page and the English on the right-hand page, so it's right transitive for you. So they finally came out with a Loeb edition of the Pre-Socratics. And every once in a while, they'll discover a new testimony. I mean, right, the three people who worked on the original German edition, they couldn't read absolutely everything, right? So people will come across a new reference. So that's the most up-to-date. And then actually, sometimes now with technology, they'll find something. So they'll use infrared to look at the old manuscript, and they'll say, oh, there's Empedocles. That was actually in Strasbourg in the year 2000. Some old manuscript, they read it, they looked at it with infrared, and you could see the faded text, and it was a faded text of Empedocles. And they found 3 more verses. So in the year 2000, that's pretty amazing to think about. They discovered 3 verses from Empedocles' poem from this text that had been, I don't know, right, originally written in 1000 AD, and then the text faded and someone wrote over it in 1500, and they were able to read the faded text. So the most recent discovery of a pre-Socratic fragment is from the year 2000. And now with, you never know if they'll find more. They might, they found like this whole trove in like Pompeii of, papyrus fragments, and they want to try to use a computer to try to make sense of it, because it's like, basically like trying to read what's been put through a shredder. Like you have about 500 pages that have been shredded, and now you have to read it. So they're trying to do that. It takes a lot of patience. And that's what they did with the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? They were like in horrible condition, and they took a couple of decades to piece some of them together. And I think they're about done, but I'm not sure. So anyways, and it was interesting because you wonder, well, what were the verses they found in the year 2000, the Strasbourg fragment. And it was basically the same tenor as the rest of it. It connected two fragments. They had always put like paragraph and then dot, dot, dot paragraph. And that's how you also know it's genuine. It connects those two paragraphs. So it's good. It reaffirms that the fragments we have are genuine. But it wasn't anything. It's the same kind of thing. You see how it's very poetic. It's very colorful. It's very allusive. He's making allusions to things, but symbolic. So. Okay, so anyway, you can see he's, right, we have a lot from his poems, and he's actually he's a pretty major figure, I guess, in that respect. So he's the first, well, there was, on page 140, so here he talks about the ancient age of innocence. Now, it's true the myths already have this idea of a golden age, right? And so we're not the only religion that has the idea of the first state of man being innocent. As I said before, a lot of these truths, these deeper truths, somehow people intuit them, or somehow people come to those ideas even without revelation. Not the idea that there was Adam, Eve, and a fall, and a serpent, but the idea that there was a kind of primeval innocence. So that was the idea of the golden age for the Greeks. And so he's not the first one to ever talk about that, but he is the first philosopher to talk about it. And so let's read 81. Yeah, he's the first philosopher to talk about a kind of a primitive utopia. So even though I've mentioned Rousseau as teaching that in the modern period, really, I mean, it goes back several thousand years. It's already here in Empedocles, and so it's interesting how, once again, how up to date or contemporary some of what he's going to say is. You're going to see he's going to talk about vegetarianism here, or at least it seems that way, right? The time before people ate meat. Of course, that's very popular now for some people. So it's also kind of interesting, number 81, because it's actually fairly historically accurate. Remember I said before, the earliest, that's what's fascinating about the ancient Greeks is things that the archaeological evidence has shown, because now, right, the whole field of archaeology with all this incredible technology and all this, right? Like I was just telling you about Strasbourg fragment. The earliest figurines that I don't know whether from like 3000 BC or something, are like I said, little mother goddess fertility figurines. It's hard to know because there's no text explaining, right? So when he says in those days there wasn't Ares or Zeus like a time before the Greek myths, the Greek pantheon, he's right about that. The Greek pantheon didn't exist in 3000 BC, right? Maybe you could say 1500 BC, probably. Research would say certainly, but it was around in 1500 in the Minoan civilization. At least it was starting up. So maybe it dates back to 2000. That would be the days of Abraham. Maybe that might be a good date. But now we're talking about in 3000 BC there was no Greek pantheon, right? And so he's actually correct about that. I don't know how he knew that. Maybe just. That's the thing, that every once in a while they say very striking things, the preachers. They talk about atoms. Well, how do they know about atoms? Well, they use reason, and they use their intelligence, and they talked about atoms. And here he's talking about the fact that there was a time before the Greek pantheon.
Do you think they could have had a oral history, like a tradition of an oral history that dates back?
That might be it, right? Maybe there was some kind of just over the millennia, yeah. It is funny how certain things are much older than you think. I was watching some documentary, and it was about like this ancient Silk Road and whatever, I don't know, 100 BC, and they found like a body. It was in the desert. It's a long, but archaeologists, as they do, right? And the body was wearing like a plaid. And they said, well, this is was someone who had come from Ireland. I never would have thought that plaid was, like basically thousands of years old. I would have thought maybe that started, or like the handshake. This is kind of, when you do history of philosophy, sometimes you do history in general, right? And so I remember thinking, I wonder, when did the handshake start? Was that maybe the Industrial Revolution, people shaking hands to make deals or something? And then, of course, with the internet, you have basically all of human knowledge kind of at your fingertips. So I just like put origin of hand, because otherwise I wouldn't even know how to find that, right? There's probably not an encyclopedia entry for handshake in Encyclopedia Britannica. Well, I just put it into the world's biggest encyclopedia, which is the internet, and it immediately gave me, it says the first instance of a handshake is from ancient Assyria. So from like, remember the Bible? There's like a sculpture of two people shaking hands. So I thought maybe 1800, well, actually it goes back to, remember the Assyrians were the first fall of Jerusalem. So, and that's the first actual evidence, right? So it could be much older than that. So things will often can be older than you think. So yes, the handshake has survived since ancient Assyria. We never would have guessed that, right? What is that? Well, 2,000 years to Christ, and then another, whatever, 800 years, at least 2,800
BC.
years. So, right, and maybe earlier. So after perhaps 3,000, who knows, 3,000 plus years, we're just using the handshake without thinking about it. So it's possible that they passed down, like, who is it? Right, there could completely be an oral tradition that was passed down the same way the handshake was passed down. And that would be actually the most likely thing, because they weren't really doing archaeological digs, or they weren't doing it at all back then. Okay, so who's you guys all read in the back, I guess?
I think I read last.
Okay, and
You read and then I read.
Timothy, number 81,
What page?
on page 140.
48.
Yeah.
In those days, there was not any errors, nor
So just,
kidemos,
these are the personifications, right? Kudoimos is the word for uproar, okay?
nor royal Zeus, nor Cronus, nor Poseidon. There was only Queen Crypsis, Aphrodite.
So she was supposed to be from the island of Cyprus. By the way, that's where the Minoan civilization existed. So it makes sense that you would say that, because the Minoan civilization preceded the Greeks. Remember, I said in 1500 AD. In 1500 AD, and it's hard, they figured out the Minoan alphabet, and they saw that it mentions like Apollo and Zeus, and then it mentions other deities who disappeared. So the Greek pantheon it's a blend of different. It has to do with the whole prehistory of classical Greece. Okay.
Men worshipped her with holy offerings, with painted figures, with perfumes having skillfully contrived fragrance, pure myrrh, sweet smelling frankincense, and with libations of brown honey poured on the ground. The altars did not reek with the bull's blood, and the practice of eating the raw limbs after ripping out the life was held in utter abomination.
Okay, so I mean, I don't know if he was a vegetarian or not, but it certainly sounds like that. It's certainly a very negative portrayal of eating meat. Now, perhaps he's just talking about animal sacrifice. Once again, right, we have fragments, so it's hard to say, but either he's talking about animal sacrifice, or he's actually saying that vegetarianism would be preferable. Okay.
All creatures, beasts, and birds alike, were tame and gentle to man, and friendly feelings were
Kindled everywhere.
kingdoms.
So, so this is the primitive utopia, right? This is long before Rousseau, and it does kind of seem similar to the Garden of Eden, right? So, in terms of the human element of Scripture, they could have incorporated things, right, from the surrounding culture. The difference is, of course, even if they're using that, we know that it's divine revelation, right? Because it's inspired by the Holy Spirit. So you'll learn about that in scripture classes. Right? Right, the idea of a primitive utopia is not exclusive to the Bible, to Judeo-Christian tradition. And it's something that, as I said, because of Rousseau, it's something that exists in our culture. So when you see Timothy Treadwell, the grizzly man, that's kind of his approach to nature. That's why he goes and lives with the grizzly bears, and basically is trying to pet them and be their friend, because it's the same mindset, right? I think Rousseau came up with it on his own. I don't know that he read Empedocles, and then he talks of the present age of strife.
83. A land without joy, where bloodshed and wrath and agents of doom are active, where plagues and corruption and floods roam in the darkness over the barren fields of Ete.
And that's one of the Furies, if I'm not mistaken. right, representing strife and all this. Okay.
Ah, wretched and unblessed race of mortals, such were the strifes and groanings out of which you were born.
Okay. Okay, and then for 85, same thing, right? Is he is he quoting Pythagoras there, right? Or is he symbolic? Is it symbolic? That's, you basically just have to some degree, you have to speculate because, right, we don't have the whole text. Okay, so basically, right, there was this time of innocence, and now there's a stage of strife. So I think, so arguing against the kind of Rousseauian thing, what you want to do, basically, I think in terms of primitive societies like hunter-gatherers, there's two extremes. One thing is to kind of make them totally innocent, which is what Rousseau did, and perhaps what he's doing here. And so against that, you want to point out the opposite, right? The truth is that, like I did talk before about the Iroquois. But the other side of the coin is that sometimes the primitive societies actually have a certain superiority. So there's all kinds of examples you could actually give. So like diet or things like that. The diet actually could be a lot healthier. So that if we ate more like that, people would actually be healthier. I mean, footwear is something. The basically, there's just all kinds of examples you could give. The Tarahumara Indians down in Mexico will like go on, they're like called the running Indians. They'll go on 20 or 30 or 50-mile runs with either barefoot or with just a piece of leather on their foot. And they're doing fine, and then you might run with Nikes, and then your knees are killing you, right? Kind of, how is that? Well, because maybe it's actually healthier to run with the strip of leather on your feet than with a big cushion, right? God made your foot so that it could run. That's called persistence hunting. In Africa, they'll do that. They'll run for 10 hours. They'll run the beast into the ground. If you do that with Nikes, probably your knees are going to start killing you, right? And your hips will start killing you, and you'll get all kinds of injuries, and eventually need a hip replacement. But it's funny how those persistence runners don't need hip replacements. So see, there's the benefit of living in a highly technological civilization, and there's also actually drawbacks that we may not even think of or be aware of, but that would be obvious to them. Now that's the more kind of practical side of life. But so basically the two extremes are, and remember when we talk about a primitive state, the state of nature, we're kind of also talking about human nature, right? So the debate between Rousseau and Hobbes on this, when they talk about the state of nature, they basically also mean human nature. Is human nature basically innocent, or is human nature basically, evil? And so the two extremes would be, right, Rousseau and Hobbes. So for Hobbes, the state of nature and human nature is basically, pure innocence. And I'm not exaggerating, right? If you read like his writings, he's quite clear about that. And then for Hobbes, remember he says, life in a state of nature is brutish, nasty, and short. So that it's actually, we're basically very violent, right? And treacherous. That's human nature. And as I mentioned before, when we discussed this before, right? Calvin and Luther teach that it's really a reaction against Calvin and Luther, who say that human nature is totally corrupt, right? Which is an extremely pessimistic way to view human nature. Then I mentioned that influences, right, Jansenism, which was actually condemned as a heresy posthumously. But even the Jansenism within the church, right, there was a spirit of Jansenism just focusing very much on the negative, let's say. And also, right, a very negative view of human nature because it's influence of Calvinism within Catholicism, right? Because Catholicism doesn't just exist in a hermetically sealed vacuum, right? The fact that there is Protestant ideas circulating, eventually they influence Catholicism, right? The surrounding culture can influence it. Sometimes perhaps in a good way, but sometimes, as is in this case, in a bad way. So basically against Rousseau, you want to kind of point out the Hobbesian aspect, right? You want to point out, well, it's not actually pure innocence, right? So against him, you would counter with, the Iroquois or many other examples, right? So I mentioned there's a book called War Before Civilization that talks about that. But then against Hobbes, are we going to agree that human nature is just, basically it seems like it's completely corrupt. So what Hobbes says, you'll see this in political philosophy, and maybe it'll come from anthropology as well. But what he says is, right, because the state of nature is violent, brutish, and short, right? I mean, short because you get killed very quickly. It does match up more with this kind of situation, right? But then it's so negative that it seems like human nature is almost totally corrupt, right? Now his solution is therefore you need a really strong government, which he calls a Leviathan, right? The Leviathan is you need a really strong leader who can use force to keep everyone in line, to keep people from, because if you leave them themselves, they're just gonna and kill each other. Do you see how that's an overly negative view, right? So the counter to that is that in the primitive state, there can be a certain innocence to that, right? And so that's the kind of paradox of a primitive state. On the one hand, it can be violent, right? But then maybe there's other situations where it's not so violent, and there can be a certain innocence. So innocence, it's not that it's the norm, but it can exist in different ways or in different aspects or in different places. So, because when I talk about like the fact that diet is healthier, the fact their teeth don't fall out, the explanations of these are actually quite simple. If when you have a diet that doesn't include huge amounts of sugar, you keep your teeth till you live to be 70, assuming that they live that long, right? When you, like I said about the hip replacement, I could give dozens of examples. But how about something that's not just kind of pragmatic? Well, so I was quite surprised, right? Once I saw this, I have no memory now of where I saw this article, but the reference to it. But it was a New York Times article of all places, and it said where masturbation and homosexuality do not exist. I thought, well, that's interesting. I was like, because when I studied psychology, right, first of all, homosexuality is portrayed as kind of like standard, and it's a very kind of charged topic. But like Kinsey said that 11% of men are homosexual. Of course, what he didn't tell you was that Kinsey was a great villain. He based that on the prison population, as if a prison population is reflective of the general population. It doesn't take much imagination to see how a bunch of men locked up together, right? That's not really a fair representation of everyone, right? And then after that, well, apparently if you have an objective thing that's not based on prison populations, which is basically skewing the data, right? It's something like, I don't know, 1 to 2%. But the point is that this article was saying where homosexuality and masturbation don't exist. And then when we did psychology, right, masturbation is very common, right? So then it turns out that these pygmies, the Aka pygmies, that this does not exist there. So of course, when the anthropologists went and visited them, they're like, well, that's impossible because, right, they're presented as just features of human nature, right? Especially homosexuality. It's a feature of human nature. It's genetic, right? There's all kinds of debates about this. In reality, I think there's a genetic predisposition that then can be brought out, right? Which is how a lot of mental illness really works, that there's a genetic predisposition, and then if there's something traumatic or difficult, it brings it out. And it's good to know that, right, for pastoral purposes. But of course, an immediate objection would be, well, perhaps they're just not telling you about it, right? Because in these societies, they're not necessarily going to tell their intimate details to the, the Western person, I don't know, right? Not necessarily wearing a suit and tie, but doesn't even speak their language, right? How do you actually know? And so they kept working on it, and basically realized that they don't have a word for those things. So when they tried to explain to them homosexuality and masturbation, there's like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like there's something seriously wrong with you guys. I'm looking at James because he's from there in Central Africa. Yeah. James has anything to add here, but I guess he hasn't visited the pygmies right there. But there were some of the few hunter-gatherers left on Earth. So which hunter-gatherer, right? We're talking like people lived in 15,000 BC, right? The cavemen. But anyway, it was quite shocking. So the other thing that's fascinating about it, right? Because like I said, you ask any scholar, they'd say, no, that's just part of human nature. And if anything, right, it's very politically and ethically charged against Christianity, right? But like, we're suppressing people's nature. There's a huge amount of rhetoric on this that's really only gotten more intense over the years and decades, right? And it's pretty hard not to. You have to kind of be living under a rock for the last 50 years to not be aware of it. But so anyway, the interesting thing is the explanation. So then they're like, well, how can this be? Because, right, they figured, well, those are just parts of human nature. And the explanation is really quite fascinating. So the book about it is called Intimate Fathers. And what the peculiarity about these people is that the children spend most of the day with their father. So they basically spend the whole day with their father, being carried by the father, because, I don't know, they do net hunting, they set up a net, and so they carry them all day, and I guess the women are gathering caterpillars, and I guess, I don't know what, they don't want to bring the kids along for the caterpillars. You can read the book if you know why they don't bring the kids along for the caterpillars. The point is that they spend the whole day with the men. Here, do you want to read it? Well, I just read the summary. Since you're part of the.
Intimate Fathers examines infant care among one of the last remaining hunter-gatherer population on Earth, the Aka Pygmies of Central Africa. Aka fathers' roles can be characterized by their intimate, affectionate, and helping nature. Aka fathers spent 47% of their day holding or within arm's reach of their infants, and while holding their infants are more likely than mothers to hug and kiss them. Aka conceptions of good and bad fathers reiterate these rules. A good father should show affection for his children, stay near them, and assist the mother when her workload is heavy.
Okay. So basically, then they were like, well, what caused this? And this whole book is about that, right? Intimate Fathers, the nature and context of Aka Pygmy paternal infant care. And they start off saying, like, basically some cultures are just cooler cultures, like Sweden or Finland. And they point out, they say, well, yeah, it's, right, like, basically in the Western world, homosexuality is not uncommon, and, right? Both these things they have no word for in their language, homosexuality and masturbation. And the answer, and once again, it's not just that like something that occurs that they're not talking about. They thoroughly kind of talk to people. Now, once again, they're not Christian. That's the other thing, right? So that's the whole point here. This is a primitive society. They're not Christian. And so this shows you how sometimes human nature, now this is not the norm, right? Even in Africa or anywhere in the world, this is not the norm for primitive societies. But there is one primitive society that does not have a word, or they don't really have a concept. People have to explain to them, like, what do you mean? They had to explain in small words what they meant by homosexuality and masturbation. And they basically reacted like, well, those are crazy people. Which is interesting because, I don't know if you remember, but the American Psychological Association, up until 1970, said that homosexuality was a mental illness. And as for masturbation, right, I mean, it's called the solitary vice in terms of traditional, morality or spiritual theology, right? The argument against it in terms of Aquinas is, right, it doesn't serve a purpose, right? There's no procreative aspect to it. So it's something that's kind of, even that was considered pathological. I don't know when that changed, maybe the 40s or 30s, who knows when. Kinsey was in the 40s, and Kinsey did a huge amount. If there's a book called Architects of the Culture of Death, and I think they have a chapter on Kinsey, which I just haven't had the courage to read because he's so vile that I just, I have to draw the line somewhere. But like for him, pedophilia was normal, so he did experiments involving pedophilia. Yeah, this is part of his experiments, and this is in the 40s. So yeah, stuff that really you think you would go to prison for, but somehow the rules don't always seem to apply. But anyway, that book, Architecture of the Culture of Death, if you want to read about Kinsey, Alfred Kinsey. But anyway, he actually helped change the laws. Because remember, there were anti-sodomy laws in the Western world. And in Africa, there's countries where they still have those, right, if I'm not mistaken. So it shows you how even the laws reflect the cultural sensibilities, for want of a better term. But really, it's whether natural law is being applied or not. So it does give a certain perspective when you hear about like sodomy being a crime in a certain African country. Well, you realize there's parts of Africa where they don't even have a word or a concept for that. So they're much closer to the natural law. So I mean, the bigger picture here is that Aristotle is in between, right? He's the mean between the two extremes. And there is a natural law within, right? That in this case, the Akapigmes are living better than Western nominally Christian societies. But what's especially interesting is that there's a reason for it, because I thought, well, maybe it's just some weird, phenomenon, because there's all kinds of weird phenomena in anthropology. But it says, right, intimate fathers is the only systematic study of non-Western fathers' roles in infant care. So it doesn't even really occur to people to work on this topic, like, right? Who would have thought about this topic? Because we just take for granted, right? The men and hunter-gatherers, the men are the hunters, they go out and hunt, they bring the kids along, they don't want the kids to get hurt. And they're not gonna chase the antelope for 10 hours with a child, right? Or fight off the lions holding a child. And then the women gather, right? So the children are always with the woman. It calls into question some of the mother-focused Western psychological and sociological notions about fathers' influence on infant and child development. And it provides a special glimpse of the lives and culture, I can't read it because of that, of a, fascinating and endangered population. All right, the hunter-gatherers, who knows how much longer they'll be around, right? Even in Africa. And they also compare them with an agricultural society that was right next to them. Am I going over?
Yeah, a couple minutes.
Okay. There's photos in here that are agricultural, and so the dads go out and work. It's more typical. The dads go out and work in the hot fields. The children stay at home, and that culture has homosexuality. It has words and concepts and practice of homosexuality and masturbation. So it's quite fascinating. And it's because of the way they hunt, the net hunting, that the children basically spend all the time with the fathers. So anyway, if a Hobbesian wants to say, or if a Calvinist wants to say to me, human nature is totally corrupt, especially the Calvinists will be guilty of that kind of thing. I'll say, well, there's also goodness in human nature. Like, speaking as a philosopher here, right? Aristotle says human nature has both. Aristotle's answer is human nature has both good and evil in it. That it has both good and evil inclinations, so it's not one or the other. Right? There are both good and evil inclinations by nature in us, right? And if the Calvinist wants to say, or the Lutheran, no, it's totally corrupt, or the Hobbesian, right? Oh no, you're just reading your own Christian values into human nature. In reality, they're all violent and murderous, and well, this is certainly Exhibit A. Also, as kind of showing you natural law, but it's interesting is the psychological aspect of it. So anyway, I think we're just about out of time. Yeah. So it shows you how, right? This is kind of more getting into ethics, I guess, and human nature, but it shows you how the psychological and the moral and the spiritual, I think of them as like it's like a triangle with three sides, not Parmenides' triangle, but like in a virtuous life, there's certainly prayer, right? But then there's also effort, moral effort, like virtue, but then there's also a psychological aspect. And really, we need all three of those. And if you think about it from a pastoral perspective too, that I think is helpful. Like you don't want to neglect the psychology. There's the far right of the church will want to neglect the psychology. The far left will want to make everything psychology. And we want to have a balance there. We don't want to just reject psychology out of hand. We don't want to make it everything and fall into psychologism either, right? But it shows you how when the psychological kind of it's like virtues and grace are being planted into the ground, right? And grace elevates nature. So when nature is already in a, the psychology is already very healthy, it yields surprising results, I guess. So anyway, that's very helpful in terms of apologetics as well. So. Okay, and if you want, I could, the article, I mean, again, you can look at the book if you want, but I also do have the article. And remember, this is the New York Times, so trust me, if it were not accurate, the New York Times, on this, they would not be reporting that. I was surprised even to see the article. I copied it on my computer, so if you're interested, I could send you an email, just say send article on ACA or something, and I'll send you the article from the New York Times. Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and will be forever. Amen.